As the offseason rolls on, the ever-growing question around how to rank QBs season to season, lifelong career journeys. We talk about Daniel Jones and what lies ahead for him this year. Yes, my friends. It is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where, of course, we are your host over here, Adam Armbrecht, covering the Brooklyn Nets and the Locked On Nets podcast. And over there is the seasoned generational take it hold of the healthy, the wealthy, the wise, Mr. Andrew Makowitz. How are we, sir, on a Wednesday?
I'm good, Adam. For you, someone that covers multiple sports, at a time like this where the NBA Finals is going on, but OTAs are going on, but like OTAs aren't real, preseason yet. Everyone's kind of just like, there's no tackling. It's all, what are you most keen on following? Like, are you still hell-bent on watching every dribble of the NBA Finals?
No. I mean, I'll watch all the NBA Finals, but I'm in draft mode for the Brooklyn Nets, 2 picks in the first round, right? Where's the speculation, trade conversations? Like, NBA is a lot sexier when it comes to their draft than the NFL is necessarily, right? There can be a lot of movement, a lot of player movement in off seasons. So that becomes a little bit more exciting. But I will say, as a guy who loves buying into a Cinderella story, I cannot stop getting excited about the Miami Heat just continuing to spit in the face of the NBA when they say that they're not going to go anywhere or that the Nuggets are going to sweep them. They just keep figuring out ways to make it interesting. So I try to watch as much as possible, but I'll be honest, there are sometimes not enough hours in the day to get it all done.
Yeah, it is interesting also that the NBA offseason seems to have more fireworks. There's more like player empowerment where they can kind of dictate where they want to move and where they want to go. Whereas like it feels like in the NFL with things like the franchise tag, like Saquon Barkley, for instance, might want to get a big deal. He can't do that because of some of the collecting bargaining things that have happened in the NFL.
By the way, as we'll get into our conversation here, obviously, the NBA also does a great job. Like, the draft is coming up at the end of June here while the NBA Finals are happening, right? So they get the double dip of coverage. You're not only talking about what's happening currently in the league, but you're also looking at what could be coming, how it could impact different teams. Whereas the NFL, we know there's a significant break between the conclusion of the season and then ultimately the draft, and then there's a long offseason and training camp. So things are spread out a little bit more. But the benefit of that is we get to have conversations like this where, over the past week or so, I saw a lot of these conversations. We know Daniel Jones is coming into a very important season for himself, for his career, just gets the big contract. So now, obviously, every time he throws a bad ball, it's going to be wasn't worth it, right? Or every time he throws the touchdown, it's going to be that's exactly what we all knew was going to happen. But when we think about like ranking quarterbacks, now it looks like, by the way, pat on our own backs, because you and I kind of said coming into last year that we thought like Daniel Jones has this potential to be a top 15 to 10 quarterback, depending on where he lies, and maybe sneak into the top 10. And while last season, across every category, was not that checked box, several boxes got checked. And now coming into this year, he's basically living on the fringe of a top 10 prospect. Where do you feel good about Daniel Jones going into this year and cementing that before we get into kind of the funny nature of ranking QBs?
Yeah, it is interesting, like whether this guy is 5th or this guy's 9th and how we decide. Is it predicated on past successes? Is it who's accomplished more? Is it only purely forward looking? Is it using anecdotal like how you did last season? Or is it over the course of 3 seasons? Like, it's so subjective, Adam, that sometimes it gets difficult to say like, okay, sure, you have your rankings, but like, what is it based on? Is it based on who's going to perform in the next 3, 5, 7 games or 3, 5, 7 years? I always find that curious when people put out these rankings.
So it's interesting though, because Chris Sims, who we know has obviously a big media career, a short-lived NFL career by any measure, but he happens to know a little bit of a father with some pedigree around the franchise. He's been putting out he actually goes top 40, which I think makes a lot of sense because there's going to be injuries and there's actually names on this list that are going to matter more than you first realize going into a year. So, I mean, we'll get into some of the other names here first, but I mentioned that Daniel Jones sits there at 11, and he falls inside of a group for Chris Sims that he labels as what's your ceiling? Now, the three players listed here I find fascinating. One of them in division in Dak Prescott, and the other one in Kirk Cousins with the Minnesota Vikings. When you think about those three players specifically being put into the category of what's your ceiling, uh, does anything jump out to you? Because I have a pretty clear sentiment around those other two quarterbacks in this group.
Yeah, this feels, pardon me for saying this, but this feels like a really lazy grouping by Chris Sims
Ooh,
because, like, when you talk about what's your ceiling and you talk about Daniel Jones being like 25, maybe turning 26, and you have Kirk Cousins who's 34 years old, like, what's Kirk Cousins' ceiling? I think we know what Kirk Cousins' ceiling is, right? Like,
right.
do you think at 35 years old they're going to unlock some new potential of Kirk Cousins? Like, to me, it's almost like you know what Kirk Cousins is. He's a top 14 quarterback, never going to be as higher than 8, never going to be worse than 14. Like, he's a known commodity to me, which I find fascinating. Whereas Dak Prescott seems like he has a ton of variables with turning over the ball, how many yards he's going to throw, new coordinators. And Daniel Jones has been one of the more polarizing quarterbacks on whether or not he is a top 15 guy in the league. So for me, this feels like a weird grouping of quarterbacks, Adam.
Yeah, and there's some other interesting phrasings here. Like just above when you get into the top 10 from 7 to 6, it's leaders and Lamar, which again, like how can you throw in Lamar Jackson as like and Lamar? Like there's that many caveats. I understand, we all understand some injury concerns or where he is developmentally in his pure passing, whatever. But like the talent has already been established there. So there are just some maybe tongue-in-cheek ways that Chris goes about framing these. But to your point, like Dak Prescott, again, I think there is an undefined ceiling in terms of how deep in the playoffs might he be able to go. But this is what I thought was fascinating about it. It's like, finally Daniel Jones goes to the playoffs last year and he wins a game, right? And they lose to Minnesota. Okay, I'm sorry, they beat Minnesota. They lose the following week. That's fine. But you establish like there's your new baseline. I am an NFL quarterback that can go to the playoffs, help my team win football games. While when you look around at the roster, there's a lot of areas to improve. When you look at Dak Prescott, it really does come down to, listen, is any team ever perfect? No, but there's been plenty of scenarios where you could paint a picture that a lot of other NFL quarterbacks in the exact same shoes as Dak Prescott would have gone on deeper runs, would have had more success. So, I'm sure if you're a Giants fan, like everyone should be watching this, you'd like me to spit some serious venom. I'm not even doing that. It's just I kind of know what Dak Prescott is. If you give him an all-pro caliber roster, maybe you can go win a championship with him. But as it stands right now, very good teams with a lot of weapons and Dak Prescott has equaled early playoff exits, and it's happened time after time after time, right? So like there is now a pattern here with that player as well.
You know what? You know what else is interesting? I've got a really fun stat for you.
There we go.
So Dak Prescott is 29 years old. Kirk Cousins is 34 years old. They clearly have been in the league longer. Dak has had some up and downs. Feels like Kirk Cousins has been Mr. Consistency. You kind of know what you're getting from him every time. Did you know, Adam, over the course of their careers, Dak Prescott and Kirk Cousins have the identical quarterback rating of each other at 97.8. So, like, there is some truth to say, like, up and down. Like, to me, it's what's their median. You know what you can
Yes.
kind of get from them. To say what's your ceiling. Daniel Jones has never even had a quarterback rating ever in one statistical season as high as both Dak Prescott and Kirk Cousins. So, yes, it makes sense to say, what's Daniel Jones' ceiling? We think he can evolve and go higher, but it is crazy. 97.8 for both Kirk Cousins and Dak Prescott. That to me is fascinating that they both have the same one.
And from where those players came from perceptually to where they are now, they've been in the league long enough that you do feel like these are the players that they are, and that they're on the same plane with one another. And that's something that I don't think 3 years ago, let's say, you would have said, no, give me Dak Prescott all the way, right? Like you would always go to the Dak Prescott route. Now, again, in both instances, by the way, you have this reservation about whether or not they'll actually ever get you over the hump. When we expand this out, just looking around this list, because my intention was just kind of to make the point that like putting Daniel Jones at 11, I think it's great. And calling, say, like, what's your ceiling? I think that is the unknown when it comes to him. But the players that now have more playoff appearances, if the team won those games or if you had a big performance, of course, then it's going to elevate you. But If you can't make the playoffs, then you get dumpstered somewhere in the back middle of the pack of this thing. Then you do make the playoffs, but you don't produce enough. So then you get shot back down, right? Like it's just such a fickle way that these things happen, including the idea of what is, I thought, behind the Giants category there, 14-19. The clock's ticking. Again, I'm not knocking Chris Sims. It's just interesting. Russell Wilson being in this makes all the sense in the world, right? Guy goes out to Denver, looks like a disaster. We'll see if they can reconstruct things now as they try to right that ship. Ryan Tannehill, I don't know if the clock can ever be ticking on a player that I don't think has the ceiling of leading a team to a championship. Jared Goff, I do find interesting. Derek Carr, Kyler Murray, I find very interesting in terms of, do you have anything extra to show, at this stage of your career, different ages among them? Geno Smith, I think, is just funny because Geno Smith should go into the like, F it, playing with house money category, because a blink of an eye ago, he wasn't even considered to be a starter in the NFL.
Adam, there's a couple of other key things that I'm looking at this list for, and we can definitely, we could probably spend an entire episode on this list if we want.
Yeah.
The two things that I noticed are, number one picks like Kyler Murray and Baker Mayfield, who everyone said were always going to be significantly better than Daniel Jones. They have fallen tremendously. And, the big funny thing of like, wow, the Giants really overthought it. The quote from Baker Mayfield when they selected Daniel Jones, like, things can happen really quickly and things can change very quickly in the NFL, where 18 months ago, you'd be like, of course, everyone would want Baker Mayfield and Kyler Murray over Daniel Jones. Now, who wants Kyler Murray's contract? So to me, I thought that was fascinating.
And that's a big part of, just quickly on that. It's like a big part of it, right? The money is a big part of it too. The expectations of where you were drafted. You can go look at Kyler Murray's stats and say, hey, if he's healthy, if he comes back healthy, why wouldn't you want to take him as much as any other quarterback on this list, and even higher than maybe Daniel Jones? But that's another big factor. What are we paying you? Have you been productive? What's your personality like as being a franchise quarterback? A thing that gets grossly overlooked, I think, when you're discussing, trying to comprise a roster around a QB centerpiece.
Yeah, the one other thing that I was going to say, and it was relevant to Giant fans, is obviously a couple of off seasons ago, the Giants wanted to bring in someone like Mitch Trubisky to compete with Daniel Jones to try to elevate him, push him. It is shocking to me that Chris Sims lists 40 quarterbacks and Mitch Trubisky is not one of the 40 quarterbacks that he lists. When you think about what he's accomplished, he has an 86 quarterback rating in his career, which is actually higher than Daniel Jones. He has, a 1.5 to 1 touchdown to interception ratio, like completed 64% of his passes. Then you look at a guy like Mike White, who's only thrown 8 touchdowns in his career, has had more picks than touchdowns, has a 75 quarterback rating, has only played in a handful of games. And for some reason, Chris Sims has him ranked all the way up at 35. Like, to me, there feels like a couple of really nonsensical ones in there. Like, why is Mike White in there? Why is Jared Stidham in there over a guy like Mitch Trubisky, who's been to the playoffs?
Sure, or even a guy like, and again, it's all subjective, but like Tyler Huntley, like we understand why you would list him there, and he falls into the backup Supremes category with Andy Dalton, a clearly experienced veteran, with Davis Mills down in Houston. But like, it's like that group, and also Sam Darnold, San Francisco. I get that it's like based on, injuries, and that could dictate what happens here, and maybe these guys get opportunities. But we've also kind of seen that when these guys have gotten opportunities, they've also, I think, for the most part, already kind of defined what their careers are going to be to varying degrees. I actually think it's insulting to Davis Mills, who, whatever he's going to be or not be, like, there was a world. I know CJ Stroud is there now in Houston, but it's just like, I don't know. Some of these things are fascinating to me because you're elevating backup guys. To your point, what is Trubisky? I don't know, but he's certainly deserving of being in some category here within the top 4 that includes guys like Sam Howell, who has been a fart in the NFL to this point. I don't mean that negatively. He's just a gust of wind. Like nothing, he hasn't established anything to this point of his career. And Mike White as well. Mike White had a moment. He had a moment in the NFL, and all of a sudden it's like, watch out. He could be taking over for Tua if Tua goes down.
Yeah, it is befuddling, Adam. You look at even guys like Sam Darnold, who's had he's 27 on the list, even though he really has not accomplished anything in the NFL. It's like, I don't know. Some of these things were a little off as we get back, but we're also nitpicking at like the 25 to 40 range, which is a fringe NFL starting quarterback in this league. It's good to see that Daniel Jones is no longer part of that argument. If you looked over the last couple of years, Daniel Jones was in the high 20s. Now he's down at 11. It feels like we're working towards that franchise quarterback that all Giant fans want.
And by the way, with all this list, as we'll turn our attention over to the Giants roster in this offseason and some questions we have about who will be cemented at the starters, what positions are up for grabs. When you think about this list with Jones at 11, Matthew Stafford ahead of him at 10, Deshaun Watson at 9, Aaron Rodgers at 8, and then Hurts, Lawrence, Lamar Jackson with the top 4 spots open. And obviously, you can think of some of the names that are going to be there as Chris Sims fills out his list. But noteworthy that there are a couple of guys, whether they're older in Rodgers and in Stafford, guys with question marks, maybe like a Deshaun Watson, and whether or not he's going to come back full force. There's room for Daniel Jones to move up this list, and you feel pretty good about staying cemented well above the Geno Smiths, Russells, Prescotts, and Cousins of the world. So, like, there's just a world where like Daniel Jones could live comfortably anywhere from like 8 or 9 to 12 for the next 2 or 3 years, be a very productive quarterback, and just, just be comfortable, man. Just kind of live in your home there and don't worry about what anyone else is saying outside of the organization.